Dog, a small project management firm, so we have a booth downstairs, and I hope you guys get a chance to come by and talk to us if you haven't already. You're still in the strategic track. This is the last track of the day. Yay! Everybody has coffee? You know, I had some of the heist refreshment, and then I had coffee, so I have no idea what you guys are going to get from me here. Okay. So again, thanks to UNC Charlotte for this. They are the track's sponsor, and for me, this is a great opportunity to tell you guys really a good story and get a chance to expose you to something new and something that's near and dear to my heart and goes back even to my personal childhood and history. So I'm going to try to accomplish quite a lot of goals within the context of an hour. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to get this done, but we're going to give it a shot. I'm going to give you guys a crash course in polar Antarctic history. We're going to touch on some leadership lessons. I want to tell you about this cat, who's really the primary focus of the talk, and see if we can get that done in about 50 minutes. So we'll see how it goes. Just out of curiosity, how many folks have heard of Shackleton? Wow. Okay. So he's become a far more prominent figure really in the later part of the 20th century in terms of recognition for his leadership contributions. And I'm glad to see that folks are becoming more and more familiar with him. I'm going to spend a lot of the time in this talk telling the story, one particular voyage in particular. And I wanted to do this, and I purposely wanted this time slot because everybody's tired. Okay, we've had a long day. This is an opportunity just to kind of kick back. Let's coast along. I'm going to hit on a couple of really important project management points from a historical context that I don't think a lot of folks will really know, and then we'll wrap it up and move on. Okay. So this is the study of project management in the Antarctic. And of course, I'm going to start with something that's, in this case, very literal. We'll do a little icebreakers for an Antarctic discussion. Try to get the temperature down to about -20, and they didn't go with me. How cold is it down there? Does anybody want to hazard a guess? What's that? -20? It's a good start. How cold can it get?
Colder?
A lot colder. Yeah. So it can get to about 100 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. And that's apt when we're talking about what happens to the surrounding seas of Antarctica. Antarctica as a continent expands and contracts in size based on the ice that's always around it. Okay. And it's so cold down there that the surrounding seas can freeze at a rate of 2 square miles per minute. Okay? It's cold.
Just out of curiosity, do we know how big the actual land, non-ice portion of it underneath is? Do we have anything?
That's my third icebreaker.
Oh, sorry.
All right, how big is it? My second icebreaker, there it is.
I think it's time for me to take
That's right.
Achieving here.
All right, how big is it? It's as big as the U.S. and Mexico combined. People don't realize how big this continent really is. All right, here's a good one. We just got through Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma. How windy does it get down there? Cat 6. Glacial winds can get up to 200 miles per hour. All right? Seems like a cool place to visit, right? No pun intended. This is a good one. How much snow does it get per year? Inches, feet? Somebody give me a guess.
70 feet.
A foot?
It's mostly ice.
About as much as Charlotte. It gets 2 inches a year. People are like, how is that possible? It's too cold. It doesn't melt, right? So 20 million years of ice accumulation on that part of the world. That's why you look at it and you think, oh, it's just a really snowy place. Well, that's true, but as far as snowfall per year, it doesn't get much. It is the driest, coldest, windiest, and highest place on the continent, or on the globe. All right, not a hospitable place. So this kind of gets into my pivot into Antarctic history. All right. Which is a very compressed historical topic in the sense that it really wasn't until the late 1800s that we had the wherewithal to get down into this part of the world. And so when we're talking about the 1900s, only the fringes of this continent are really known. All right? And then when you have the Industrial Revolution, the advent of coal, you can actually penetrate further into the space. All right? It's difficult actually getting to that landmass again because it freezes at such a rate that it's surrounded by these ice sheets, and moving traditional vessels down to this part of the world is near impossible. You need coal-powered, steam-powered vehicles to actually crush through it and get down to the continent. All right. So what's really fun about Antarctic history is a very compressed time frame of about 1900 to about 1917. Okay. And it's what we call the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, okay? And this is a period of rival explorers, all right? And I equate it to what was going on in the 1960s. What were we trying to do in the 1960s? Space race, exactly. First man on the moon, very similar. It was a global phenomenon. Who could actually get down to the Antarctic? Who could explore it? Who could claim land? Mountain ranges, all in the name of their king or queen, okay? And of course this one, who's the first that can actually get to the South Pole, all right? Now people say, well, what about the North Pole? That was going on at the same time. You have the Arctic, which is on the north, and the Antarctic, which is on the south, and you have explorers that are actually bouncing between the two. I want to be the first to this northern stretch, I want to be the first to that southern stretch. And so you have well-known figures like Roald Amundsen, who's probably familiar with some of you are familiar with him from Norway, who actually took a shot at getting to the North Pole first. Didn't make it. Oh, let's go for the South Pole. So it's a really interesting time in our global history, period of excitement and to be frank, outright stupidity. Okay? And I love this quote. Kim Stanley Robinson, if you've read his Antarctica book in 1998, it's great. First you fall in love with Antarctica, and when you get there, it breaks your heart. And nothing is more apt to that than the stories that we'll talk about here today. So quick crash course on the history. I said late 1800s, early 1900s, but I want to talk about it in context of failure, all right? We talk about project failure all the time, and, and the crazy things that can happen, and in this case, a history strewn with death and destruction and insanity and starvation that can go on with these kinds of expeditions. And from all these different countries. So in the US, Charles Hall, his attempt to reach the North Pole, he failed really not because of an issue with technology and seafaring, but the long winters, the freezing cold, and the human spirit, okay? Depression and panic, and he was actually killed by his own men because that voyage went so wrong. Adolphus Greely, he lost almost all of his men to starvation because of poor project planning. It didn't have the right provisions, didn't really know what he was doing. 19 of his 25 men died, and then the folks that actually survived that were brought up on charges of cannibalism. Okay, and on and on. And you find some very interesting phenomenons within the ice itself. I talk about the freezing of Antarctic shelf. People who would go down there, they'd get stuck. They'd be sailing along, and all of a sudden, the ice would enclose around them, and they couldn't move any further, and then they would have to winter with their ship frozen in the ice and wait for the spring for the ice to break up so they could actually sail on to their destination or get the heck out of there. And that is a period of 4 to 5 months as you're trying to change seasons. And what do you do with your men who are stuck in this predicament of starvation and cold and darkness? And so the issues of insanity are very common in these kinds of expeditions. And it goes on and on. A key figure that I think everybody would know would be Robert Scott in 1902. He is the British hero of Antarctic exploration, the one that everybody propped up as the archetype of polar exploration. Took a number of shots down to the South Pole. One of his first was in 1902, his attempt to reach the South Pole first, and made some pretty blundering mistakes himself and found out this thing called snow blindness, which they never had encountered before, issues of scurvy. You're down in an ice shelf. What are you going to do about actual vitamin C intake? And of course, starvation, a common theme. All right. So the age of polar exploration is wrought with horrific encounters. But you're seeing the lessons learned aspects of all these things coming together, and explorers talking to each other over time and figuring it out as a community. Okay. So the real meat of polar history happens between 1908 and 1912. This is the fun race to the South Pole, which is an actual race that's going on between Scott, who's on the left, and Amundsen, who's on the right, when they were on the the Antarctic continent at really the same time. I'll get to that just in a second, but one of the people that actually tried to go for it first, other than Scott's failed attempt, but I don't put Scott in that 1902 voyage really in the equation because he only made it about 50 miles before he killed half his people. So the first guy to really make a good go at it was this fellow by the name of Shackleton. All right. Ernest Shackleton, who is a Irishman raised up as a merchant marine, approached his expeditions in a very different particular way, was a student of leadership, psychology, provisioning, and he was the one who really put the first successful voyage to the South Pole together. It was called the Nimrod expedition, and his track to the South Pole came pretty darn close. We're talking about a journey that's roughly 3,000 miles, all right? He made it within 97. And for about 4 or 5 years, he held the record and supplanted Scott as the hero of Britain. He came that close, okay? But what's interesting about him, and this is where we start putting our project management hats on, he was a meticulous planner and knew exactly where he was and where his supplies were running at the time. And so when he hit mile 97, it's a really specific number, right? He hit mile 97, he knew that if he pressed on and actually got the pole, and he could have, on the way back he'd kill himself and his people. So it's a question of, you know, the pride of being able to claim that prize for your country or protecting your own men on the journey. So, but he turned back and he made it back safely. All his men survived. So the real interesting race that I think the majority of folks know is between Scott and Amundsen. Again, Amundsen was a figure from Norway, and Scott from Britain. And this is the two expeditions. You have one that's called the Fram expedition, and you have one called the Terra Nova expedition with Scott. But they were on the continent at the exact same time, and it was a true outright race. Okay, and there's no Twitter feed. I mean, nobody knows exactly where they are at the time, but they did. And what was interesting about Roald Amundsen is he brought his own dogs to the equation. It's the first time that people actually used dogs as an Antarctic tool, and was an ingenious geographer, and he figured out new ways to get down there. And not to rush to the ending, he is the one who claimed it. He got there first on December 14th of 1911. And when he got there, and he knew Scott was on some other part of the continent tailing behind him, he leaves not only the Norwegian flag, but he leaves a letter for Scott himself, which I always thought was kind of funny, what such a letter would say, because you'd think, I made it first. But the reality is, you know, he wanted to communicate to his fellow explorer, I made it. If I don't make it back, please take this letter and communicate it to my king that I at least made the pole and got to this location. And the reason why we know that is when they found Scott, the letter was on him. So what happened with Scott is he actually did make it to the South Pole roughly 30 days later and was very upset to find the Norwegian flag floating in the breeze. But he made the very mistake that Shackleton didn't make. He pushed his men all the way to the pole to claim the prize, and the real sad part of it, he never was first to begin with. It's a Norwegian honor now. But because he made that decision on the 800-mile return, he lost all his men. They ran out of food, and he actually died in a storm in his tent with the men that were left on the expedition about 10 to 15 miles from his next depot, from his next supply depot. So, bad call. But he had the letter from Amundsen on him, and so when they finally found Scott in a later expedition, they have all the historical artifacts of what occurred. So they were able to validate that what happened did happen. Okay. Any questions? It's my crash course in Antarctic history. So why are we here talking about Shackleton now? All right, and what made him so special? I love this remark. Coolness in the face of danger, resource under difficulties, quickness in decisions, never failing optimism, and the faculty of instilling the same into others. Remarkable genius for organization, consideration for those under him, and obligation of self. This belongs on every PMP's LinkedIn profile from a reference, right? This is the kind of stuff you want to have written about you as a leader. What made Shackleton different was his focus on people, was his focus on group dynamics. And this is a pioneer of group dynamics. We study this stuff. We are educated on this stuff, even in our PMP prep courses, okay? Shackleton was an amateur psychologist, and he knew from all of these controversial figures of his day, Freud, Le Bon, Pavlov, I'm sure everybody's heard of Pavlov, okay? These were outcasts within that period of time. Psychology was incredibly taboo at that period of time. But he thought it to be of incredible importance when you're taking men out into the depths of darkness and coldness. And what did they produce? They produced theoretical concepts around group behaviors, problem solving, decision making, consensus building, and probably the most important at the bottom there, performance under extreme stress, which is what Pavlov was all about. Everybody knows him for the dog drooling bell thing, but Pavlov was the first to really look at human reaction when exposed to overwhelming stress, overwhelming pain, all very relevant with Antarctic exploration. So when we're talking about the theories in today's form, and everybody sees this in their project management studies from Bruce Tuckman of 65, forming, storming, norming, performing, and journeying. I'm not going to go through all of these. Tuckman was a Shackleton student, in a way. He, for the formation of his own theories, looked to Shackleton and the application of the psychology concepts that we were talking about before, and he translated it into his own forming of teams, okay? So all the leaders that we're accustomed to knowing here in the 20th century looked to Antarctic exploration as really the playground for how human behavior is, how it is performing in a stressful environment. So I always found that really interesting. And if you get anything out of this talk today, it's really this, is that when we are studying these concepts in project management, it's good to know where they're coming from. And I hear this, and I remember studying this stuff when I was going through my PMP. And you shake your head, and you're like, yeah, this is common sense, okay. But it's not common sense. And it took people like Shackleton to actually put these theories into practice in extreme circumstances to figure out what really worked. So I look at Shackleton as a project management pioneer, as does Tuckman, okay. So what's going on in the 1900s? What makes Shackleton so unique? And when we're talking about norming and performing, what is norming in the 1900s? Okay, we understand. We had a talk earlier today from Tom Fellman in this very room on the strategic track about not theory but application and trying to understand norming when you're dealing with generational challenges, millennials versus Gen X. But what is Shackleton dealing with in the 1900s? So this is a period of time where there is incredible upheaval and revolution. You're talking about the Industrial Revolution. You're talking about the movement to almost a much more egalitarian society. But the leaders of the day that are coming from old school command and control, manufacturing plant type environs didn't like this stuff. But what Shackleton was doing from the context of his own leadership, the stuff that we take for granted. I mean, this is stuff that we talk about all the time today, flattening of hierarchies. I want to work for a flat organization. You know, abandoning formalities, rejecting this taskmaster level. When we're talking about the upper classes, rejecting upper class perks. Shackleton realized that when you're dealing with the stresses and strain of an Antarctic environment, that stuff has no place. And he got rid of it all. And so when you compare him to his colleague of Robert Scott, you're seeing a very different approach to leadership. And you're seeing here the embodiment of 19th century leadership to 20th century leadership. And we are now in a 20th century leadership age. We are in a Shackleton leadership age, okay? So what's the difference? The difference is really looking at the personality of these two men, okay? Scott is somebody who is dour, he's bullying, he's controlling. It's very 1800s military models, okay? You look at Shackleton on the other side, he's a very warm, egalitarian, humorous figure. Scott was brutal. He was known to torment his men. Shackleton on the other side would have fun with them and tease them, but he would never humiliate them. Scott was somebody that orchestrated every single movement. He was a micromanager. Shackleton, on the other hand, gave his men responsibility, independence, surprised me with the results. All very good concepts for running project teams, correct? Common sense, right? If it's so commonsensical, why did it take this long, all right? Secretive, untrusting, talked openly and frankly with the men about all aspects of the work. And probably the most important of all, put his team at risk to achieve his goals. Valued his men's lives above all else, all right? As project managers, this is probably the hardest thing that personally I even have had to deal with. You have sponsors riding you. You have harsh deadlines. It's very easy to do this, okay? It's a lot harder to do this. But at the end of the day, in a leadership context, our success is based on the abilities and the stability of our own teams, right? Shackleton understood this, and he understood it in an extreme way, all right? Strategic planning, this is probably my busiest slide, so I probably should kill it, but initiating and chartering, meticulous planning, forming the best team, monitoring, control, accountability, closing out an endeavor, all very common to you in terms of your project management processes. But Shackleton was an innovator in all of these areas, okay? He was innovative because he opened up the polar community. He understood the concept of lessons learned. Remember, we went through that long list of leaders and their failed expeditions. That's kind of important information to know if you're about to go on something similar, eh? Meticulous planning, and master innovator of Antarctic tools and techniques. He had an organizational genius, estimating, budgeting, and risk mitigation. We'll go into that here shortly. And probably the most telling is his formation of the best team. He hand-selected his people. And he wasn't just looking for seniority, he was looking for an interesting mix of idiosyncrasies. He's looking for those who are creative, they're optimistics, and they, most importantly, they bring talents that he didn't have. Okay. Monitoring control, we talked about this before in terms of his 20th century leadership style, breaking down hierarchies and cliques, opening doors to his people, generous with information. He was very good at building an esprit de corps amongst his team. And probably the thing that I've struggled with project management, not in terms of, you know, you're the one who's in charge of it, but to have both the vision of what the project's supposed to achieve, but the meticulous planning and the willingness to take it all on yourself. Because at the end of the day, you're the one who's most responsible, okay? And then finally, closing out the project, closing an endeavor, and leaving a legacy, understanding that you are part of a community that can benefit from your expertise. That's why we're here, right? That's what the Project Management Institute is all about, okay? He understood this concept. So, any questions? All make sense? Is it all coming together? All right. Has anybody heard of this story? I know you heard of Shackleton. Are you familiar with the story of the Endurance? Yeah.
This whole journey.
This is his third Antarctic expedition. This is the one he's most known for. Okay. If you watch something on the History Channel, they're probably going to be talking about this. So when we did our crash course on the race to the South Pole, we were talking about 1908 to 1911. Amundsen claimed the pole in 1911. It's now 1914. you have what is very similar to a Apollo 13 type of paradigm. We've made it to the moon. Why do we need to go back? These expeditions were often funded by the governments themselves. And at this point in Antarctic history, which is beginning to sunset, governments really weren't that interested in it anymore. Shackleton was always driven to do something new, and he knew that just because you captured this one ceremonial prize doesn't negate the importance of actually going back and understanding what this continent is. So he charted a new expedition for himself, which is called the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, to cross the Antarctic from sea to sea, securing for the British flag the honor of being the first to cross the South Polar continent. Which I think is great, because instead of going here to the South Pole, he wants to go all the way down and across. And so he started to handpick his own team. And he put out this advert in the paper of men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, but honor and recognition in case of success. Ernest Shackleton, 4 Burling Street. Okay? That's how you advertise for PMPs, right? That's what you want. So you would read that and like, that sounds awful. 5,000 people applied for this, and he took 28 of them. And these were sailors and scientists and, of course, journeymen, Antarctic people, you name it. And he started a planning. And this was a 2-year supply that he was planning for. And what's interesting is I talked about lesson learned, all right, and all the things that you have to understand that you need up in these extremes. And some of these things make sense. Okay, coal, you need some rifles and ammunition, you need your radios. But these are interesting. This is typical Shackleton. Look at these stars. What else is he bringing along with him?
Entertainment.
Games, books, a library, a miniature billiard table. He's bringing cocoa, chocolate, lots and lots and lots of chocolate. A bike. The heck do you need a bike in Antarctica for? Who knows?
Wouldn't you need a bike?
Yeah, that's very good. Gramophones. This is pre-CDs, right? And, soccer balls and a banjo. There was one particular person that applied to be on this expedition, and one of his claims to fame was that he was a banjo player. And Shackleton thought he was great, and he felt that music is good mental medicine. And so he wanted to have a banjo player to go along with him, which I think this is really dangerous. I don't think this is a particularly good idea. If you want to go to the deep, cold circles of hell, that's where the banjo players are anyway, so I don't know why you need them.
Sing.
Yeah. No, I'm in a banjo married family. Okay. So he's ready to go, okay? And it's 1914. What else is going on in 1914? World War I. 7 months of preparation for this, and Shackleton's ready to go, but he's about to set sail, and on August 5th of 1914, World War I hits. So Shackleton offers up to the Crown his ship, all of his provisions, all his men for the war effort. And he sends this offer to this fellow by the name of Winston Churchill, who's the First Lord of the Admiralty, who at the time felt that this kind of expedition was foolhardy and unnecessary, but Shackleton sold him on the idea. And in a telegraph on the day that they were to depart, Shackleton received a note from Churchill that said only this: proceed. I love this map. This is a great map. So Britain's way up there. Antarctica, okay, you have South America. This is all great context. Where they're going is down here. South Georgia Island, it's just a big rock and ice and sea lions. It's about 22 miles across. It's about 80 miles long. And it's a whaling port. And it's a launching point to get down here into the Weddell Sea, which is where they're going to set up their continental camp and then drive across the continent. He has other players that are going to meet him on the other side and pick him up. and take them home. But the majority of the crew is on the Endurance, which is going here. And he got there on November 5th of 1914. It's a whaling port. It's the last bastion of civilization he's going to see. He stayed there for a few weeks, rested his men, and off they went. So when you're driving down into the Antarctic Weddell Sea area, you're going to encounter what's called pack ice. And the way you get through it is to essentially drive your ship through with coal. But in general, they're looking for these things called leads, which are openings in the ice that's floating. And it's sort of this circuitous way of navigating your way down. You would hit a lead and travel for a few miles, and then that would close off. Then you go to another lead and close off. On occasion, you would just power through. And so for a number of weeks, that's what they would have to do. And these are great photos of the guys watching the captain as he's driving through the ice, and you can see even behind them the kind of track that they're making along the way. Okay. But what's interesting is that as they move down in closer to the continent, about only 100 miles from their destination, they're starting to encounter pack ice that is way higher and way thicker than usual. They're encountering above what is 60 degrees latitude, which is very unusual for that time of year. So what was happening at this time is that their efforts to drive through the pack ice were daunted. They were using up almost all of their coal to get that last 100 miles in. And the captain made a decision that he would park the ship, wait till the next day to see if more leads opened up in front of him. It was a bad night to do that because that night it dropped from 20 degrees Fahrenheit to -20. And the next day they found their ship completely encased and they couldn't get out. And they're stuck. Now off on the horizon there's leads opening up 100, 200 yards away. So they have this grand idea that they're actually going to get out of the ship and cut their way through. So with pickaxes and saws, they were trying to cut their own lead. And for 48 hours they did this, but it was to no avail, and they were completely stuck. Yeah. What's interesting, there's a lot of these photographs that are available to us because Shackleton he was a big PR guy, and he brought in a guy named Frank Hurley, who was a master photographer, who captured all of this. So if you're wondering, why the heck do they have pictures of all this stuff? That's the reason why, which was very unusual. It was the most documented polar exploration of the time. So that's why you have such an improvement over the photography from like Scott's expedition and Amundsen's expedition. So they have these wonderful pictures of the ship that's ensconced in ice here. But he's stuck, and what's just so demoralizing is he's one day away from his landing point. And you can get out and move around. Might as well. You're not going anywhere. So one of Shackleton's strengths is his optimism. I think we all can practice this as project managers. When things are at their most dire, to at least even outwardly express optimism about your situation to your men. Shackleton was an experienced explorer. He had been to Antarctic 2 times before. The majority of his crew was not. And you could already feel probably in that expedition when they're stuck in ice, what are you going to do now? But because of lessons learned, this is a common phenomenon actually. Ships get stuck in the ice all the time. The ice is not the problem. Again, it's the spirit of your men. Okay? And so he had to maintain this optimistic view, encourage them to focus on preparing for the spring ahead. Because the plan is, in this situation, that spring will come along, the ice will break up, and they'll sail under their destination. And as a project manager and a 2-year planner, remember he has 2 years of supplies, he knew that this was a possibility. So he's fully prepared from a provisioning standpoint to winter through. And he can still make it to the Antarctic continent and complete his mission. But again, you're stuck in a sea of ice. It's cold, it's dark, And you have basically folks that are of varying classes and varying educational backgrounds all together in a confined space. Of course, you're going to have a whole litany of challenges that have to do with team dynamics, group dynamics, psychological problems. And so the challenges that you're facing with your Shackleton is this us versus them dynamic, okay? So what does he do? He balances the work of scientists and seamen. He calls them the ABs versus the BAs, or the able-bodied seamen versus the Bachelor of Arts people. And his strategy is to make all of the jobs of the ship the responsibility of all team members. Okay? If you're a scientist, you're scrubbing the commonplaces. Okay? If you are a high school educated seaman, you're learning how to use the meteorological equipment. All right? You have to unpack the provisions. Everybody's caring for the dogs that were along the journey with them. Everybody had a responsibility, and he created this regimen day in and day out of order and discipline, and as a result, equality and egalitarianism. Okay? And it was called his democratic crew. The other challenge is disunity. I don't want to sit next to that guy. You know, he's a stuffy upper class so-and-so, or I don't want to talk to this person because, he's just a highbrow scientist, but he broke all of those things down, and he did it with very simple tools and techniques, things that, we do all the time, right? We have breakout sessions, we have get out of the office and go bowling together, but this is all new to this kind of leadership. So what Shackleton would do is he'd invite all the crew members to like the dinner table. And there's no separation of officers, there's no separation of the scientists and the seamen, and he purposely sits everybody at the same table, and Shackleton puts himself right in the middle. Not at the head of the table, right in the middle of them all. The other challenge is boredom. Okay? Here's my miniature billiard table right here. Finally comes into play. Here's your soccer balls that are coming into play. He mandated exercise, got everybody out of the ship. Everybody has to go out and have, X number of hours of physical activity. He had skits, and he had gramophone concerts, and haircutting competitions, you name it. Anything that kept the men engaged and a perpetual sense of team. And the biggest challenge of all is fear. And how do you combat that? And he did it simply with one simple message. I will not put my crew ahead of what we're trying to do here. If we cannot achieve our mission without danger to you, we are going home. Very different from his predecessors. So what's going on? They're stuck right here. But the currents don't stop. The ocean flows in the Weddell Sea go west-east in this circular fashion. So as he's stuck in the ice, the ship is being pulled further and further away. Okay? And they're able to survive at that point, but the other thing that's happening is that as spring comes along and the ice does indeed break up, it breaks up in sort of an inconvenient way. It's starting to wedge, buckle, shift, turn, and that puts an unfortunate strain on the ship. Prior experience in polar exploration had indicated that the ice would break up and the ships could break free. Not in this case. And on October, in a matter of days, that ship started to list, and it actually turned, flipped over in one moment. And the men had a feeling that this was happening, and they would be sleeping in the hull, and they would hear this moaning and scraping in the darkness of the ice as it would drag along the hull. Very unnerving. And when it actually did turn over, they had no choice but to abandon ship. They were taking on water, and they knew that ship wouldn't last. And indeed it didn't. But it stayed up for long enough for them to get the provisions out of the ship. And for months they sat and they watched that thing go down. And on November 21st, yeah, for a month they did this. On November 21st, 1915, the ship breaks and it sinks. So what do you do now? You're still on a floating iceberg, middle of nowhere. Nobody knows where you are. You have no ship. You do have lifeboats. So one of his ideas was retrofit the lifeboats and start dragging them west to land. That didn't last long. They were making like 100, 200 yards a day dragging the ships. And they realized that this was not feasible. And so he created a series of camps, ocean camp, and essentially asked the guys to live on the ice and let the currents do the work. Remember I was talking about how that current was kicking them west and north? They were going to ride that out all the way to the top. And with the hope that once the ice broke up, they'd be far enough north that they could make an end run for an island or some sort of landmass. But they still had 5 more months to wait. So they had this thing called Ocean Camp. And it was an awful, awful experience. And they no longer have the sanctity of their own ship. They're living in their tents. And there's not enough sleeping bags. There's not enough blankets. There's not enough food. And how do they make it? Again, this issue was not the ice. You knew what the ice was. That was a known variable. Everybody was cold. It's the morale of his men.
So it's one of the problems that he had more men to account for than initially planned for the expedition, because he's got the crew of the boat as well that wasn't going to go on the expedition?
That's a good question. No, because that boat still had to go back. So they had provisions to...
Yeah, but there were people on the boat that were going to take it back.
Yes. I see what you're saying. Yes, and what was a challenge for them too is that the stuff that he could take off that was suitable for polar survival was for a smaller team. The whole team, all 28 people, weren't going to go down across the Antarctic shelf. The seamen weren't going to do that. That's a good question. So he had just a finite number of sleeping bags to go around, and they actually had to have lotteries. And so one night you'd get a good sleeping bag that was suitable for the conditions. Another night you wouldn't. And they would have to augment their food. And the way they augmented their food was, again, rifles and ammunition, and they survived on seal and penguin, which was awful. One of the things, though, that was that Shackleton knew from his earlier expeditions in 1902 was the issue of scurvy. Where are you going to get vitamin C from, an unhospitable environment? You need fresh meat. It's not necessarily oranges. It's fresh meat, and the fresh meat would have to come from the animals that you could hunt and kill. And there were hunting parties that they would have to set out to find them. Okay. So after 5 months of living this way, ocean currents kicked them up to this point, and the ice started to break up. And what was interesting at this time was, I always found this kind of funny. They knew that they were getting close because some of the scientists were getting seasick because the icebergs were getting thinner and thinner and thinner. That all of a sudden they could start to feel the swells of the ocean, and so that was actually a big problem with seasickness for them. And the other kind of frightening thing is that they said that they could hear the whales underneath them, and the whales would sometimes come up and bump the bottom of the icebergs for them. So they really wanted to get off the ice. This was not a good situation. And they had one moment that was truly dire, and Shackleton knew at this point that he basically had to go for broke with this situation. Is that one of the icebergs actually split open underneath a tent, and Shackleton was there. It was his own tent. It split open. One of the guys went under in his sleeping bag, and Shackleton, who was no frail man, this is 6'4", he's a big fella, reached down and was able to grab him as he was sinking and pulled him up, sleeping bag and all, and dropped him back on the ice. So that's not a good way to wake up. But at that point, it's an emergency situation. You got to get out of there. And so he put all the men on these boats, and they started to head north to try to find land. And the issue is one of current. You really can't go this way. Ocean currents are kicking you this particular direction, and so when you're in lifeboats, you have to basically give with the current or take what the current gives you. And so they were going to head off to these smaller islands up north with the expectation that maybe a whaling vessel would see them and catch them. Okay? And that's what they did. And they went for this island here, called Elephant Island. And this is a grueling journey. This is essentially a week-long journey of being in a life raft. All the life rafts are strung together by rope. There's whales all around them, bumping the boats, and they're just rowing for their lives. There's stories of frostbite and your hands being basically having to be chipped away from the oars, dehydration, dysentery. It was a horrible experience for them. But miraculously, they actually made it to Elephant Island. 7 days of this, stuck in a dinghy without sleep. And it's interesting to know, April 15th, 1916, they had been 1 year, 4 months since they'd actually set foot on land. They had been on ice that entire time. Okay. So what's the problem at this point is you're here in Elephant Island. Nobody knows you're here. Unfortunately, they didn't hit the islands that they wanted to, which is a key whaling avenue. And so they couldn't stay there. They didn't have the means to sustain themselves. So the decision was to go for broke and try to get back to South Georgia. This, by the way, is 800 miles. All right. This gives a better sense of what we're talking about. You can't go this way. You can't go to Chile. All the currents are going this direction. Got to take what the current gives you. And so they're going to try to make and run to South Georgia. So Shackleton chooses to do it himself. He's not going to take his entire team. Most of them are too sick at this point to handle a journey of that length. And the majority of the boats are so beaten up they can't take all three. So they retrofit one. They choose one called the James Caird. And with the carpenter, they apply a canvas top. They give it a sail. And he takes provisioning for 4 weeks, a fortnight, to get up to South Georgia. And these are, if you're familiar with the southern Atlantic, these are some of the worst seas in the entire world. Okay. And this is actually one of Frank Hurley's last photographs of Shackleton and the men he chooses as they disembark for South Georgia Island. It's brutal. And surprisingly, 2 weeks after they leave, they miraculously make it back to South Georgia. And this is a heralded journey. It's considered one of the greatest boat journeys in modern maritime history. And there are sailors that try to repeat this kind of journey for fun. But one of the things they run into, though, is when they hit South Georgia, they land on the wrong side. Okay, all the whaling points are here, and I mentioned before this island is 22 miles long. All it is one glacier. You've been at sea for 2 weeks, malnourished. Having sea legs is an understatement at this point. And they have to get all the way across the island so that anybody knows where they are and what they're encountering. So if it can't get any worse, they got to cross this island, and that's exactly what they do. So they took a carpenter's axe, a length of rope. They pulled screws out of the James Caird and shoved them into their soles so that they would have modern crampons to climb the glaciers. And they walked for 36 hours straight, 22 miles. Just like crossing that sea in the James Caird is something that people try to replicate today, now you can do it for fun. At South Georgia Island, you can go do the Shackleton Crossing, this 22-mile journey. And with modern equipment and experienced climbers, that's a 72-hour hike. They do it in 36. They are starved. They are dehydrated. They're angry. They're upset. They're exhausted. But Shackleton, there's one little anecdotal story I love. Is one of the issues that they would have is the temptation to just go to sleep and not wake up. It's freezing cold. And what Shackleton would do, his men would be begging for a nap. And he'd say, I'll give you 30 minutes. Just go to sleep. I'll give you 30 minutes. And instantly they knock off. And then he turns to them and goes, all right, let's wake up. Time to go. Oh, thank you, boss. Oh, God, I'm so glad. I've got my 30 minutes. But he knew. I mean, he knew that was not going to be a good situation if they kept sleeping. He'd never wake them up. But they made it. So he stayed on South Georgia, trying to get back to his men. He took a vessel 3 days later after he got back to try to get to Elephant Island, but once again, pack ice got in his way. He couldn't even get within 60 miles of that island. He tried to get back to his men for 4 months to get them off that island. And he made multiple attempts to do so, and he bankrupted himself to do so. And with the last dollar he had in August of 1916, he went to the Chilean government and asked for this rinky-dink ship called the Yelko. This is his 4th try to get his guys out of there. And when he finally got there, surprisingly, they're all alive. They all made it. And the people he put in charge on that island were instrumental in that. I'm leaving a lot out due to time, but the fact that they made it through this ordeal is miraculous. Here's a picture of the Yelko here. I'm glad Frank Hurley still had film left. And he took his men out of there. So, wonderful story, right? You're headed home. You're due a hero's welcome. You survived this incredible journey. You didn't lose a single man, right? And was he heralded when he came back? No. He's a coward. He ran. While they were gone for those 2 years, what was taking place? World War I meat grinder. His country had changed after that, okay? And his men are seen as cowards. And it's so mortifying to many of the men on this trip that they instantly enlist. Tim McCarthy enlisted, and he died 6 weeks later in the battlefield. So an interesting change in heroic definition. It's no longer about bringing back your people and saving your people. It's about giving your life for your country. That's heroism, right? And that's what they expected. Shackleton today is not really known that well because of that circumstance. His history was buried because of World War I. Wasn't well documented. It was really his family that brought him back to the fore, and there was another organization that brought him back into common leadership discussions, and that is NASA. NASA understood that if they were going to put men into cold, dark, cramped spaces for long periods of time, who did it right? Who was successful? Shackleton was. And there are now litanies of unclassified NASA information that reference what Shackleton was doing. And all of those studies bubbled up into what we were reading in Tuckman, Maslow, you name it. All of those leader icons that we talk about from a project management standpoint. You can point it back to these kinds of Shackleton experiences. Okay? So Shackleton went back. He didn't have enough. Then January 5th of 1922, he decided to go back. It was just a calling for him. And the majority of his crew from the Endurance went with him. Said, hey, I'm going back to Antarctica. Who wants to come? Yeah, I'll go. That's crazy. But he went down there, and at this point, he's about 46, 47 years old. He made it to South Georgia and was ready to launch, but he died in his sleep from a heart attack, which is apt, I think. And he's buried at this Whaling Chapel. And here's his tombstone. And you can go see this. You have to kind of walk around all the fur seals that are in your way, but you can go see this grave. This is a pilgrimage spot for explorers, hikers, seamen. So that is Shackleton. Any questions?
Well, I just have a comment. This is really good and interesting for me because in 2005, my company sent a group of us to Catalonia, Spain, to do it was like a week leadership course solely based on Shackleton's journey, which is really awesome. So this is really nice. Good.
Yeah, I think he's becoming more commonly known. But his story is fantastic. And for me, as a project manager, dealing with team dynamics, dealing with team challenges, I mean, we have the luxury of working in air-conditioned buildings and climate controlled, and not the stress that we deal with is nothing like this. But the concepts are the same. The challenges we run into are the same. And it's good to know the context of where these theories came from. So that is what I wanted you guys to get out of this talk. I appreciate your time today. Thank you.